one of the greatest railroads in history. 50 years of great railroading. The Penn Central. Penn Central, baby. You can count on us. Penn Central. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Yeah, that's the way to go. Penn Central, baby.
I'm Alfred Perlman. I'm a railroad man, and I'd like to tell you something about our railroad and what we're doing on it. People tend to take the railroad pretty much for granted. We in the railroad business probably haven't told the story of the changing conditions in our...
I'm Phil Bell. I'm a railroad man too, and trains are in my blood. Today, railroads are telling the story of everything they do for America, right here on the All Aboard podcast. Everybody, welcome back to the All Aboard podcast. I'm your host, Phil Bell, and I am excited to be back with you. First of all, let me apologize to all of you out there for the slowness in getting more content out to you. We have been working very hard, and we are now more active on social. So please check us out on Facebook and X, and we've got them linked under this video in the description. But as promised, today we are going to talk about Penn Central. Penn Central, you can count on us. Penn Central, probably considered one of the biggest business failures in the history of the United States. But I want to ask an important question. Was Penn Central really a business failure? Now, we had planned to do this video during February, and you know what? We'll just say that we're as late as the Penn Central train, that we're doing it in March, because February 1st, 1968 was when Penn Central came about. And it was a merger of the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads. Now, the idea of merging these two carriers was not new in 1968. It had actually originated in the 1950s with Robert R. Young and James Symes. James Symes leading the Pennsylvania Railroad. Robert R. Young, who had led a very, very aggressive campaign that we talked about in one of our earlier episodes, Barbarians at the Gate, as an activist investor to take control of the New York Central, which at the time was a faltering railroad. And the idea that the New York Central, which was one of America's premier businesses, could be faltering was something that was alien to so many people. Now, you've got to think about the times. We're talking about the 1950s. And the 1950s, of course, there was no internet, there was no X, there was no way for activist investors and short sellers like Hindenburg Research, it's very well known for getting the message out that, hey, this company may not be doing so well, or that company may not be doing so well. And here's another thing. Railroads and trucking companies, so those regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission at the time, were also exempt from using the Securities and Exchange Commission as the regulator of their securities. Now, I want to be very clear. I am a free market guy. I do not believe the SEC should exist. I do not believe there should be regulation of securities at all, but that is going to become apparent why the question of who was regulating and watching over these securities mattered as we get a little bit further into the episode. So, like I said, this idea was originally floated. Robert R. Young was very much in favor of it. He had taken over the New York Central. He found out that for all the fighting that he had done, it was not a very good railroad, and it in many ways was headed toward bankruptcy. And his leader of the New York Central, Al Perlman, really did set about to work on the New York Central and improve its fortunes. And this meant things like going from the famous 4-track main line that you've seen in a lot of videos of the 20th Century Limited, going down to 2 tracks where possible across New York State, using CTC or TCS instead of automatic block signaling, so that the remaining tracks could carry enough freight and passengers, because the New York Central had a very large passenger business at that time, although that passenger business was in decline, as was its freight business, because this was at the time when America, in particular, New York State, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, this was going from becoming America's very, very profitable industrial heartland into what we now know as the Rust Belt. And so that meant gradually at first, and then quickly as time went on, a lot of that industrial capacity that really supported railroads like the New York Central and like the Pennsylvania went into decline, and those railroads went right along with it. And let me also add something else. The Pennsylvania and the New York Central were not just these mighty railroads that took freight over big main lines like what's now the Chicago line of Norfolk Southern or the middle division of the Pennsylvania over Horseshoe Curve. While they did that, and they did that quite well, both the Pennsylvania and the New York Central had a very, very strong and thriving local business. So that meant a large number of serving yards, these facilities where you would bring a few cars in after going and collecting them from local industries, combining them, and then taking them to a larger yard, maybe a hump yard, like what would become Alfred E. Perlman Yard, now Selkirk, in outside of Albany, New York, the Selkirk area. In order to be put into longer manifest trains. But the problem was these serving yards and a lot of these industrial tracks and so on, which have become very, very strong providers for today's short line railroads owned by holding companies like the Genesee and Wyoming and Watco, and even the independent short line railroads like SMS Rail Services in New Jersey, which, by the way, is one of the prime examples of the railroads that have made this type of operation work. Those operations, though, were killing railroads like the Pennsylvania and the New York Central. That's because the union requirements for crews were just as onerous for those operations as they were for your mainline operations. And so in some cases, that might mean cabooses. In other cases, that certainly means at least 3 people on the train, if not in some places, 5 people on the train, no matter how few cars that you're moving. And let's remember, while it's not necessary for each move that a railroad makes, freight or passenger, to be profitable, overall, it has to be profitable. And what that meant when you started to have this large number of employees that were needed for relatively small operations and relatively short distance operations, that meant both the Pennsylvania and the New York Central struggled with their labor costs in a very, very big way. So as a lot of the post-World War II, optimism headed into the 1950s, where things from what we remember or what we've watched in a lot of those videos from that period was a very genteel time, a very good time of growth. It was not a great time for the Pennsylvania or the New York Central. But then something happened. Robert R. Young shot himself. He ended up being so distraught about the New York Central's financial performance because, let's remember, what he did was waged a political type campaign. Basically everything down to the streamers and the hats and the political speeches and so forth to win control of the New York Central. And he did it because he believed that he could provide greater returns to shareholders and that he was going to look out for the small shareholder. He sold himself as a man of the little guy, just like they do in politics today, right? So when he realized, oh shucks, this company is in such a deep hole, I don't know what to do, he shot himself, and that was it. And with that went the first iteration of the attempt to merge the Pennsylvania and the New York Central. Well, it wasn't that long after he was gone. There were a lot of other machinations that took place. The Chesapeake and Ohio was able to outfox the New York Central for control of the Baltimore and Ohio. The New York Central acquired a lot of the stock, waged a proxy fight, very similar to the proxy fight that Robert R. Young had waged for control of the New York Central, but they ended up losing out to the C&O. And one of the big reasons they lost out is because the people who were tendering their shares looked over and said, well, wait a second, do we want to be in bed with the New York Central, which, while for all intents and purposes, for everything you might have seen on the outside, looked like an amazing railroad, as we know, it was falling apart. The Chesapeake and Ohio, on the other hand, was very much like the Norfolk and Western, which itself was a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania, and that will figure in also later, a conveyor belt for coal. And that conveyor belt for coal, combined with the industrial heartland that they served, but in their case was very, very heavy on automotive traffic from Detroit on the old Pere Marquette territory. And this was the reason for buying the Pere Marquette, was so it could serve that area in Michigan that was growing. And while a lot of the Northeast and Midwest was going into the Rust Belt, the automotive production was growing. Let's remember that, because Americans were still taking to the automobile. So when you look back and you see a lot of old pictures of the C&O and Chessie System moving auto parts, and then subsequently CSX moving so many auto racks, we used to joke about that me and my fellow rail fans, that every time you saw CSX, all you saw was auto racks. Well, that was because they served a very, very auto heavy growing territory in Michigan, which was the opposite of what the Pennsylvania and the New York Central were doing. They went there and they had substantial operations there and served some of those same plants, but that did not compensate for what they had in other parts of their system. So that is the backdrop that you have. This New York Central now decides, well, since we lost out on the Baltimore and Ohio, and we can't get into the Baltimore and Ohio, Chesapeake and Ohio merger, which became the Chessie system, you know what? Let's see if things work out again with the Pennsylvania Railroad. And by this time, what they did is Pennsylvania had replaced James Symes, who had been its CEO, with Stuart Thomas Saunders. Stuart Saunders had been the CEO of the Norfolk and Western. He was a Virginia lawyer, originally born in West Virginia, but a Virginia lawyer who had risen to the top of the N&W, and he had gained some success because he had put together the Nickel Plate Wabash N&W merger, which also included the Wheeling and Lake Erie. Now, remember, at the time, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the N&W was an affiliate of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania controlled about 30%. It's really closer to about 31, 32% of that company's stock, and they dictated how the N&W was going to do what it did. Now, it had a fair amount of independence, but there was even a point in the N&W's history when it was technically based in Philadelphia. That's because its parent company, the Pennsylvania Railroad, was right there. And based on some of the rail executives that I've talked to in the past, the N&W was really propping up the Pennsylvania Railroad in its final years. Because while the Pennsylvania was struggling with that Rust Beltization, as well as declining passenger revenue, declining commuter revenue, high costs, and a lot of local traffic that really did not generate the revenue commensurate with its costs. At the same time, the N&W, just like the Chesapeake and Ohio, was paying great dividends thanks to the Pocahontas region coal that it moved, whether for export purposes or to other parts of the country for steam and steam purposes being power plants and maybe a little bit of metallurgical, although it was not quite as big as steam coal there. And then when combined with the nickel plate and the Wabash, again, you had a lot of great exposure to the growing part of the now Rust Belt, which again was the automotive. So the N&W is very unique. And of course, that Wabash that at least was owned itself largely by the Pennsylvania Railroad, over 80%. So Saunders being able to come in and put together 4 really substantial railroads and make something successful out of it, and not having much in the way of hiccups, when he was placed as head of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and one of the goals of their directors when they put him in that seat was for him to lead a merger with the New York Central, they thought they had all the cards and they were ready to go. Now, as you probably expect, and as you know from some of our earlier podcasts, doing these kind of mergers today would be a lot easier than it was in the 1950s and the 1960s. And what was so interesting about the 1950s and 60s is that was during the time when the Interstate Commerce Commission wanted to facilitate parallel mergers. And the idea of the parallel merger was, well, if you've got 2 railroads that travel between the same 2 cities or the same 200 cities, they can reduce some of their physical plant, and ultimately what's left will be more profitable and therefore better able to serve the customers. Now, this was done in a very, I say, idiotic way, because let's remember what's happening here. This was an attempt by the government to say that we know the best and we are going to substitute our judgment for that of the market. But that's the way the Interstate Commerce Commission worked. That's what they did for its entire existence. And that was one of the big reasons why these railroads were in trouble in the first place. There were 2 other, though, participants in the Penn Central that we got to talk about. One of them never got to be in it, and that is the New York Susquehanna and Western. Why the New York Susquehanna and Western? There was some trackage on the east end of the NYS&W, some of that area near Croxton Yard and so forth, that the Pennsylvania really, but ultimately the Penn Central wanted to get at. And the NYS&W at the time was controlled by Irving Maidman, who most people don't like because he pretty much ran the railroad into the ground. He was pretty terrible. He had purchased it for real estate speculation purposes since it owned some land near Edgewater, right on the banks of the Hudson River, ran the company pretty poorly. It had continued to decline. It was not much more than a couple of streaks of rust. that were going through northern New Jersey. And however, the Penn Central did ultimately not buy the NYS&W, and that is what set the stage for its ultimate sale to Walter Rich and the 1980s era resurgence that has become so famous for the Little Susie Q. The other railroad that did become part of Penn Central, and a very interesting part of the PC, was the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. Now, you're very familiar with the NYNH&H. You know about the McGinnis color scheme. You know about the FL9s. You know about the PAs, the electrics, the EP4s, the EP5s, all the really cool stuff they had, the MUs. The New Haven was primarily a passenger railroad because they operated the Boston to New York segment of what is now the Northeast Corridor, although for much of the time, the majority of their trains actually ran into Grand Central Terminal. As time went on, as you can expect, with the growth of the automobile, the Connecticut Turnpike in particular, a lot of the people who traveled on those trains went away. Another problem the NYNH&H was facing was the same thing that I mentioned with the Pennsylvania and the New York Central. They had relatively short hauls. Even their longest haul, which would have been from the Boston area going out to Maybrook Yard on the west side of the Hudson River and connecting with the Erie and the Lehigh and Hudson River, as well as the New York Central over in that area as well. And at one time, the New York, Ontario, and Western, but not by the time that we're discussing, since that railroad was long gone then, even that was not a very long haul. So while it did serve an important purpose for a very long time, which was to provide the Erie and ultimately Erie-Lackawanna with access to New England, and to a certain extent, the Pennsylvania Railroad with access, great extent, the Pennsylvania Railroad with access to New England, in that case via the Lehigh and Hudson River, the New Haven was not doing very well at all, and it was already bankrupt by the time the mid-1960s where we are having these conversations. Patrick McGinnis, he had been booted out and ultimately went to other railroads, committed fraud, and ended up in prison after he had painted all the equipment in that very, very unique and striking mid-century modern style livery, that is very well known to us today. George Alpert, who was a trustee, who was his successor, really tried to do some interesting things with some of the unique trains that they brought along in the hopes of stimulating new passenger business. It all failed, and the New Haven was a basket case. But here's what's interesting about the New Haven. As we've mentioned in some of the earlier episodes, the New Haven itself was never merged into Penn Central. The New Haven rail assets were acquired by Penn Central in exchange for Penn Central stock, but we're going to get back to that in one moment. So after all of this time, after all of the hand-wringing that went on, and there was a lot of hand-wringing, some of that included labor, and this is where one of the big problems with Penn Central came about, because Stuart Saunders, being very much a people pleaser and just trying to get things through, made an absolutely abhorrent labor deal, so where basically even if you were let go, you were going to get paid for a very, very long time as a result of the merger. So you had that as one problem. Number two, as you well know, you've heard a lot about the red team and the green team if you've done any reading on Penn Central whatsoever, and you know that while the Pennsylvania and the New York Central were long, very proud railroads, their managements did not like each other. And they did not like each other as a result of the legacy of competition. They were strong competitors right up until February 1st, 1968. The problem with that was when you put together two groups of people from companies that despised each other and really didn't think that the other was the optimal merger partner, because the New York Central, as I mentioned, would have rather been involved with the Chesapeake and Ohio and the Baltimore and Ohio, and the Pennsylvania Railroad at its core probably did want to merge with the N&W and have that strong coal portfolio really juicing its earnings. But they got together and things fell apart from the start. Now, if you had to ask me, what is the real reason, what is the biggest problem that Penn Central faced and why things went to a place that was not recoverable, I would simply say it was a very, very flawed, if existing at all, operating plan. And let's think about what they did, which is that they wanted to start merging rail operations from the center of the operation, which was Ohio and Indiana, and then have a lot of the impact of the merger spread to the east end and the west end of the system. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. Since Penn Central, Pennsylvania, and the New York Central were primarily east-west railroads, that's where the majority of their traffic went. Now, they did have some north-south traffic, but it was almost entirely east-west. If you create disruptions in the middle of the railroad, then it will be very, very difficult for all of the extremities to recover. Traffic will pile up in a vast majority of places if it can't get through where it needs to go in the middle. And that's exactly what happened. And so the meltdown started from day one, and it continued and continued. Then in 1969, beginning in 1969, the New Haven's assets were included with the Penn Central. So now the Penn Central had multiple lines that were going into New England, Boston, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and so on, and it grew. Now, remember what I said a little while ago about it was the assets only, and that was interesting. Well, it was interesting because the Penn Central didn't have any money. The Pennsylvania didn't have any money. The New York Central didn't have very much money. So how are they going to pay for the assets of the New Haven, you ask? Well, if you're a follower of corporate transactions, you know that while many companies may not have as much money as they need, they always have plenty of currency if they're publicly traded, and that is called their stock. And so the Penn Central used a large block of its own stock to pay the New Haven trustees for the assets that they acquired. This made the New Haven's estate, and I say estate because it was bankrupt, the largest shareholder of Penn Central. So if you're a rail enthusiast, I want you to think about this. You think about the big, mighty Pennsylvania Railroad and the Broadway Limited and the General and all the coal trains going over Horseshoe Curve and truck train and this and that and the other. All of the Pennsylvania. Now think about the New York Central, the 20th Century Limited, the Commodore Vanderbilt, the Flexi Vans, you name it, Al Pearlman. And they were all answering to the trustees of the little old New Haven. How about that? That just shows you how interesting corporate transactions can be. And that's why whenever, I hear things like this, I always like to get into it and read. So I'm a corporate transaction nerd just as much as I am a rail enthusiast and railroad nerd. And I think you'll enjoy a lot of that if you really look into it. Now, I've given you a little bit of a topical history of that, but let's get into some of the nuts and bolts. Now, as of 1963, the Pennsylvania Railroad had 9,705 route miles. The New York Central had 9,926, so it was actually a little bit larger in terms of mileage than the Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania key assets, 31% of the Norfolk and Western, 86% of the Wabash, which was by that time leased to the N&W, 33% of the Monongahela Railway, which it shared with the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, which itself was controlled by the New York Central, and also the Baltimore and Ohio. 50% of the Toledo, Peoria, and Western, 20% of the Chicago and Western Indiana, and the CNWI owned Dearborn Station. Although Pennsylvania's trains did not go to Dearborn Station, it owned 100% of the Long Island Railroad. But here's what's interesting. It owned, by that point, Buckeye Pipeline, and Buckeye Pipeline Company, which still exists and is now owned by an Australian infrastructure investment firm, was extending its pipeline in the 1960s to serve Kennedy Airport. So while passenger rail revenues were declining on the Pennsylvania, they made a very astute investment in buying Buckeye Pipeline and then going to serve the people who were taking their passengers away. Now, we all bemoan them leaving the passenger trains, but if you're a company, if you can get those people to pay you one way or the other, that's really good, and that's what they succeeded in doing with Buckeye Pipeline. Next, you had Arvida, which was a land development company primarily focusing on Florida. Now, at the time, Florida was not what it is now. And if you really think about it, had this investment been made in 1995 or 1985 rather than the mid-1960s, it would have been a grand slam home run. And Arvida ultimately became part of the St. Joe Company, which was for a long time the St. Joe Paper Company, and itself controlled the Florida East Coast Railway and the Apalachicola Northern Railway, just as an aside. But St. Joe went from being in the paper business and the railroad business to developing property in Florida because it was Florida's largest landowner. So later on, when it went on and purchased Arvida, that only added to their reserves and their ability to develop. So that also was a great investment on behalf of the Penn Central. It controlled Great Southwest, which developed Six Flags. And Six Flags, now we know that well as the chain operator of amusement parks, Six Flags Great Adventure, being my favorite in New Jersey. Not far from many Pennsylvania railroad lines, of course. But at the time, all of this was still in its infancy, as was Arvida and Buckeye Pipeline. One other company that it invested in, and this was very controversial and would be exposed in a lot of the hearings that took place about the Penn Central bankruptcy, was called Executive Jet Aviation. Now, this was not a common carrier airline like Eastern Airlines, Braniff, Delta, and so on. This was more of a private charters and so forth, but they actually had the thought that maybe one day it would become something closer to a scheduled airline. And so they were putting money into that, but they were doing it through a subsidiary to make it more difficult for regulators to go after them. Because remember, in those days, it was verboten for railroads who were still seen as being the great Satan, robber baron bunch of the 1800s, which, by the way, they never were. That was always a hoax. And so any attempt that they made to invest in air or trucking was either tightly scrutinized or almost always disallowed. And I'll take you back no further than the Pennsylvania Railroad itself investing in a company called Transcontinental. It's like Transcontinental and Western, which became Trans World Airlines, TWA. It was invested in that. And then the Interstate Commerce Commission, being the killer of fun and killer of opportunities that it had become, ultimately required them to sell out of that. So that was another part. Now, why is executive jet aviation so important? Well, like what Great Southwest became, Six Flags, like what Arvida became part of the St. Joe Company, and like the Buckeye Pipeline Company that's still around, well, executive jet aviation still exists too. And it's owned by somebody who incidentally also owns a railroad. And his name is Warren Buffett, part of Berkshire Hathaway. And it is now a part of NetJets. So it shows you a lot of what the Pennsylvania Railroad was doing to invest in things outside of the railroad as the railroad was declining, as they were barreling toward Penn Central, actually ended up working out. And you'll see why that matters in just a little while. But let's switch gears, or switch tracks, over to the New York Central. The New York Central owned 99% of the Michigan Central, which we almost always associate with the New York Central anyway. That's partly why, or entirely why, you also had New York Central trains going to Illinois Central's Central Station, a lot of Centrals there, in Chicago. That's because the Michigan Central went there, whereas New York Central Prime itself went over to LaSalle Street, where the 20th Century Limited, Commodore Vanderbilt, and so forth operated out of. But other trains, such as the James Whitcomb Riley on the Big Four, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis, as well as the Michigan Central, would operate into Central Station with the Michigan Central. 8% plus of the Baltimore and Ohio. Of course, that was from their attempt to take it over that failed. 2.73% of the Erie Lackawanna. This is actually news to me. I did not know that, and I was not aware of why, but that might be a legacy of some of the past ownership, Allegheny Corporation and so forth, that were involved with the New York Central in the past. And of course, by that point, though, Allegheny itself had the largest shareholding in the New York Central. The Indiana Harbor Belt, the New York Central and Michigan Central had an overwhelming controlling stake in the IHB, with the third partner, in that carrier being the Milwaukee Road. The Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, of course, but here's where it gets even more interesting. The New York Biltmore Hotel, the Commodore Hotel, which of course would later on be redeveloped as the Grand Hyatt in New York City by a guy named Donald J. Trump, now our president. The Barclay Hotel, the Roosevelt Hotel. Roosevelt Hotel gotten a lot of heat lately. It's been in the news as being one of the places where a lot of illegals are being housed, and was shut down to simply do that. And the Waldorf Astoria. These hotels were all owned in a company called Realty Corporation that was a subsidiary of the New York Central. Now, the NYC did not necessarily operate all these hotels itself, just as is kind of custom nowadays, where you would have outside operators to handle it and you would own the hotel. That is a lot of what the New York Central did in those days, but it also shows you that a lot of their efforts to develop the real estate around their railroad had gone on for a very, very long time. That goes back to the heyday of these companies. Some of the land that they had ultimately, of course, became home to the Pan Am building, which is right next to Grand Central Terminal in New York City, and also the Helmsley building. It's known now as the Helmsley building. Before that, it was known as the New York General building, and before that, it was known as the New York Central building, which was the New York Central's headquarters. And that is one of the famous buildings at the end of Park Avenue, where you see cars driving in and out, and they still drive through it because the street is built through there. Well, the New York Central, when they sold it, became the New York General building, and that was just because they could alter Central to General without changing the lettering too much. And then, of course, Harry Helmsley and his wife, the famous or infamous Leona Helmsley, ended up buying it, and it became the Helmsley building, which it still is today. So I wanted to point all that out because I wanted you to get a breadth of the assets that Penn Central really had and how it went far beyond just the railroad lines that they are best known for. And I want to add one more thing. Let's not forget Madison Square Garden. The current Madison Square Garden was also partially owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad, later Penn Central. And that's because that was the land that the original Pennsylvania station in New York City sat on. Of course, it was unfortunately demolished to make way for this arena. And as a result of that, which ended up being a partnership with ITT Corporation, which itself was a conglomerate that started in a network business, although theirs, of course, was telephones. The Pennsylvania and later Penn Central ended up having a stake in both the New York Knicks and the New York Rangers that played in Madison Square Garden. So there you go, a very, very large, diverse collection of assets that started with railroads and spread to just about everything else all over the country in the case of both companies. A couple of other key points to point out. The Pennsylvania in 1952 generated revenue of $1.02 billion, but by 1963 that had declined to $840.1 million. Net income for the Pennsylvania in 1952, $39.3 million, spiking up to $41.5 million in 1956, but all the way down to a loss of $7.8 million in 1960 and income of $9.1 million in 1963. So that shows you the volatility, but it also shows you that the Pennsylvania was on a downtrend. And this is really noteworthy when you look at the freight and passenger revenue, 767 plus million in 1952, but by 1963, freight down to just a little over $642 million. Passenger revenue, almost cut in half in 10 years, going from 156.3 million in 1952 all the way down to 90.3 million in 1963. The only bright spot over that period, mail revenue, up from roughly 40 to over 47 million by 1963. New York Central saw the same thing. Total revenues, 806.9 million in 1952, all the way down to 623.3 million in 1963, and a similar decline when it came to the passenger service, as with the Pennsylvania. In fact, in theirs, it was cut more than in half, from 124 million to about 56 million. Now, February 1st, 1968, you have the merger. Everything falls apart immediately. New Haven adds in. It gets even worse in 1969. And so by June 21st, 1970, the Penn Central is bankrupt, and it's a very sad scene. The story you read where they basically put together this bankruptcy petition. They go to the judge at his home because it's a weekend, knock on his door, he signs it, and all of this great railroad history hits a wall that no one ever thought it would. And there were a couple of other participants who helped it get along that way. President Richard Nixon, he was willing to use the Defense Production Act, something that you heard a lot about during COVID, to help prop up the Penn Central, but there was another guy named Wright Patman, who the U.S. House Post Office is named for. He was a congressman from Texas. He basically said, over my dead body, you can use it if you want. You can spend money that you, the executive branch, have to spend to prop that railroad if you want, but I'm not going to go along with it. And when the Nixon administration realized they were not going to be able to get any money from Congress to support this, then they said, well, let it go, and that's it. And so that's what ultimately was kind of the last straw that led to the bankruptcy. So what happened after? Well, 1980, the Staggers Rail Act is signed. And it's interesting, it's named for Harley O. Staggers. Now, after the Penn Central bankruptcy, Congressman Staggers wanted to subject railroads and trucking companies to SEC regulation of their securities, because one of the reasons Penn Central was believed to have gone bankrupt was because the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, did not understand and could not protect investors in securities the way that the Securities and Exchange Commission can. But about 10 years later, he is the name of deregulation and letting the railroads as close to as possible run free and thrive, which shows you how impactful the Penn Central bankruptcy was. Number two, thanks to what Congressman Staggers did and those who pushed for it, because it wasn't just him, it took decades and decades to get to that deregulation. A lot of very big unsung heroes there. But one of the benefits of that deregulation was the ability to take these secondary routes, as well as industrial tracks, short lines, branches, and so forth, and either abandon them or sell or lease them to smaller carriers to operate. So a lot of that traffic that would have been very, very difficult for the Penn Central and its component railroads to serve is served very well by carriers like the Providence and Worcester and SMS and the NYS&W and Finger Lakes Railway. And so on. And so the ability to do that, which is something that didn't exist in the same way during the regulated era, has been a boon to customers, and it's been a boon to railroading. And that is a benefit of the Penn Central decline and collapse. Ultimately, what happened? Well, Penn Central also had its business plan implemented by Conrail. And a good example of that, you think about the Pennsylvania Middle Division. Well, most of the traffic that runs over that now goes right up the Cleveland line to the former New York Central main line to get into Chicago, rather than continuing through Crestline and Fort Wayne and so forth to get to Chicago. So a lot of those rationalizations of mainline trackage that Penn Central had planned to do, they actually ended up taking place under Conrail. So while Penn Central's business plan, operating plan, I should say, may not have been the best, their business plan ultimately was. And then let's also remember that as a result of the bankruptcy, Penn Central was able to do what a lot of other companies successfully did without going through bankruptcy, and that was separate non-rail assets from rail assets and create thriving businesses out of both. Conrail, of course, became a thriving business with the majority of the Penn Central's rail assets. The Penn Central Company, later Penn Central Corporation, kept those real estate assets, selling some off, Buckeye Pipeline and so forth, and buying others, and using the money that they got from the sale of the rail assets to Conrail in order to become a diversified conglomerate in the 1980s that eventually moved into the insurance business by the 1990s, and is still, interestingly enough, an auto insurer today as part of the great American insurance company's empire. That was Carl Lindner, the same guy who for a long time owned the Cincinnati Reds, purchasing them from Marge Schott. What's interesting about that is in 1995, according to Wikipedia, and I didn't have a chance to go back through the SEC filings and look at this, but they did 1.8 billion in revenue as an insurer in 1995. And why do I bring that up? Because if you go back to 1952, Pennsylvania Railroad revenue was 1.02 billion, and the New York Central revenue was 806.9 million from rail operations. So that means without the trains, without most of what went along with Penn Central, they were able, as a much smaller company, to do the same revenue that they had done in 1952. Now, I know you're probably thinking, wait a minute, Phil, it isn't really successful if you're doing the same thing that you were doing in 1952. But keep in mind, again, a much, much smaller company. in a much different diversified industry. It shows you actually how anemic things were for the railroad back in 1952 and how much better they were for the Penn Central as a company in 1995. Now, I'm not saying that to say the railroad business is a bad business, but at the time, it was a terrible business. And Norfolk Southern and CSX ended up dividing Conrail, with the majority of the Pennsylvania Railroad properties going to the Norfolk Southern and being put together with those of the Norfolk and Western. So if you think about it, what ended up happening is that the Pennsylvania was able to merge with the N&W, take over the Southern and the Erie-Lackawanna, and get the best parts of the New York Central. It's almost like they planned it that way. Now, we know they didn't, but if you think about it, that's exactly what happened. That's what Norfolk Southern is. It's the Pennsylvania Railroad in the core. It's the N&W, which they controlled for a long time, the Wabash, which they almost completely owned, the majority of the Erie-Lackawanna that still exists, and it's probably what they would have kept if they had just been able to buy it outright, they being the Pennsylvania Railroad. They shed all of the non-railroad assets, made a good business out of them, got them to go somewhere else, took over a gigantic railroad in the South, the Southern Railway, and have the best parts of the New York Central that they want without the New York Central management. Oh, and by the way, they also have the headquarters in Atlanta in a much nicer place than Philadelphia. So yeah, if you really think about it, by that logic, Penn Central worked out really, really well. So let me know what you think. If you like what I had to say, if you like my logic, and what you think about the Penn Central, how you would have handled it. Would you have done the merger in the first place? You name it. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And one programming note, we will be continuing our railroad, our train show tour all around the country. We'll be putting out on our website, yes, our website, which is being relaunched, where we will be over the next couple of months. So make sure to stop by and see us. And as always, thank you so much for choosing All Things Trains and the All Aboard podcast.